Hello, welcome. All right, and so let me get the names down. Before we begin, are there any questions? Any questions? All right, thank you for joining me. And please remember, okay, at any given time, feel free to unmute yourself and or raise your hand and ask a question, okay? And so notice I'm going to share the screen. Let's see here. Looking for right here. So notice what we're looking at as far as questions, right? The first 8 pertain to Reconstruction. Then we have Turner's thesis. Then we have evidence supporting Turner's thesis. And you should be able to find this on Canvas, okay? Marxist history challenging Turner's thesis. The Muscle Slough incident. All right, Hispanics in the West. Hispanic responses to their plight in the West, Chinese immigrants in the West, an anti-Asian sentiment, okay, 15 and 16, railroads in the West, Native Americans in the West, the mechanization of agriculture, and old Midwestern cities like Cincinnati and Chicago. All right, so that's what you'll need to know for test 2 as I go into the PowerPoint, okay? So any questions so far as we jump into this? All right, so Turner's thesis, right? It's romantic. It's pretty much tied to court history. Remember court history, a king or queen asked a court scribe to write a history of him or her or of his or her kingdom. And that person is going to select facts and organize those facts, interpret them, and present them in such a way as to make the emperor look wonderful, right? And so court history makes those who won in history look wonderful. It justifies what they did, praises what they did, etc. And so tied to court history is the notion of American exceptionalism, that we are an exceptional country. We're special. We're unique in a good way. All right. And one of those is that we're a land of opportunity, supposedly. All right. Opportunity for all. So to him, right, that's what makes America. That's what Americana constitutes is equality of opportunity, of economic opportunity to rise or fall by your own merit or meritocracy, right? Whatever you earn, whatever you deserve. And so to him, what was vital in securing American meritocracy in this country was a frontier. He believed that a frontier almost naturally creates an egalitarian society. And by egalitarian, I mean everyone on equal footing, okay? And so there are 2 broad categories that I divided into is he states how the West was equally dangerous for everybody, and the West provided equal opportunities for everybody, right? And the dangers, he even romanticizes that, right? The obstacles faced in the West, because he kind of employs a little bit of Darwinian theory and states that you know, basically nothing ventured, nothing gained, that the American dream is all the sweeter when you have to suffer for it, when you have to overcome obstacles, right, to achieve it, and that it kind of kills out the weak, the unlucky, etc. And so at any rate, he tries to convey the image of the West being equally dangerous for everyone, but laden with opportunities for everyone as well, okay? So firstly, right, when you look at the post-Civil War history, you still had a lot of people coming along the overland trails, right? And that's tied to your earlier class, your 17A class, with the Oregon Trail and all that. But you have the Oregon Trail, the California or Mormon Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail are just the most well-known of the overland trails. And of course, you faced a lot of adversity across those trails. First and foremost, disease, all kinds of different diseases, but a lot of people contracted typhoid fever, dysentery, etc. And so tuberculosis was very common at that time as well. And but also, the landscape, just going through the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada or the Mandan Mountains, those were tough to traverse. And then you also have the elements of the weather, right? And going through the Great Basin, extreme heat and aridity, where you didn't have water for long periods of time. And it was tough. And then add to that is to the problem with Native Americans. Yes, we have evidence of Native Americans attacking settlers moving westwardly. Now, to some people, they contend, some historians contend that this has been oftentimes grossly exaggerated, like Richard White, an historian. But nevertheless, it did happen, and we have evidence of it. And there was salt that was put into the wound of the Native Americans, because many times they were given treaties that were pretty much forced upon them. And so I think of a few treaties like Fort Atkins, Medicine Lodge Treaty, and the treaties at Fort Laramie, Laramie. And in those treaties, they forced the Native Americans on reservation grounds, and they made them promise to allow white settlers to come through and traverse through their territory, and they were to give them safe conduct. Well, needless to say, in many of these treaties, the rightful leaders were not okay with them. I think of, like with the Sioux, I think of Red Cloud, who stormed out at Fort Laramie, and then even Spotted Tail, who gave his acquiescence to it when it was found that the Anglo settlers, the Euro-American settlers, were breaking their word, and they were stopping and pulling up stake and trying to build cabins and farms on this reservation land. The natives became furious. And so a lot of Spotted Tail's followers broke from him and refused to abide by it. And so you had the Sioux, you had the Crow, who were infamous for extorting travelers in many firsthand accounts. And by that, I mean, right, holding a gun to them and saying, I want your horses, or I want this or that, or else I'll kill you. You have the Comanche and the Apache down further south, who developed a fearsome reputation of resistance as well. So at any rate, you do have evidence of that moving into the West. Then in addition to that, you have a virtual temporary state of anarchy in some of these Western areas. And by anarchy, I just mean by the strict definition of no government, no governing institutions, no police force, no constable or sheriff, and legal institutions to uphold law and order. And so, and that goes back to your 17A class with the gold rush and the Louisiana Purchase. And a lot of that area was incorporated territory. And there was a methodical process that was supposed to be followed for them to achieve statehood status. And many areas in this far West were just trying to attain that statehood status. So they had yet to be, the land had yet to be surveyed, put out for public consumption, and so many 6-acre square plots to make cities, and so many of those to make counties, and so many of those to make a state. And needless to say, they didn't have police force, etc., or sheriffs, etc. So you have evidence of that, and you have evidence of that going awry with banditry, outlawry, and you have, as a response to that, you have federal deputies and marshals that were sent no closer than Oklahoma, sent to the far west to try to apprehend suspects, and oftentimes notoriously take them back dead or alive. And so, as far as due process and what we're accustomed to, that was in short shrift in certain areas of the far west after the Civil War. And then you also have vigilantism as a response. And with the vigilante groups, I think of like the Dalton gang, who were chased down by victims of their depredations and chased them all the way down to the Mexican border and killed them. And this was common to post their pictures as a deterrent to other criminals not to engage in that activity, or the people would not withstand it. Baxter and Caldwell, as cities, as towns, deputized everyone therein, I kid you not, and gave them the power to shoot down outlaws that came back into town. The Bob Shirley gang in 1896 of October, they went into Meeker, Colorado, and the General Hugus store across the street from the bank where they were robbing it, the gentleman gave out guns to the inhabitants of Meeker, and they awaited their exit. And when they came out of the bank, they were all shot down, almost without exception, by the people of the town. So you have evidence of that, right? And I have a picture here of Jesse James. And, you have the narrative by some historians that he was carrying on the Civil War. And so that's a component that may or may not have relevance to this topic as well. Is a lot of those who came here as cowboys and as independent pioneers came from the South, and the South had been beaten in the Civil War. They were desperate. They had a chip on their shoulder about having lost the war, etc. And so that may or may not have some relevance to this Wild West image. And then, when you look at in particular, the cattle towns and the mining towns developed a reputation for lawlessness because you would have thousands of miners flood into an area and they didn't have police infrastructure established yet. Or you would have these cattle towns like with Joseph G. McCoy of Abilene, Kansas, or in Abilene, people would take cattle anywhere from 300 to 1,000-mile trip, and certain trails became famous. They would take them up to the nearest train depot, which at one point was Abilene, and they would get a handsome amount of money for each head or steer, each head of cattle that they had brought, and that they would sell on to the slaughterhouses by way of the railroad depot in the cattle town. Well, just like with the Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads, just as with the mining towns or the cattle towns, would-be entrepreneurs, business owners, right, flock to these areas to try to make money off the people they're in, and with goods and services. And the goods and services that we often hear of in the cattle towns and in the mining towns are those of a more mischievous bent. So like bordellos with prostitutes, gambling houses, saloons with lots of drinking, etc. Right? And add to that the demographic of most of the cowboys were young and single, and it makes for a recipe of perhaps something approximating anarchy. So at any rate, they would come in and they would kind of go wild, if you will. And so they brought in infamous gunslingers and boxers like Tom Bear River Smith and Wild Bill Hickok. So they'd come into town, and then to add to this image of the Wild West is sometimes the sheriffs or constables that they would bring in and hire would abuse their authority, and they would engage in personal disputes, personal fights with people, using their badge as a cover or justification for what they did. So Wild Bill Hickok, for instance, killed Davis Tutt over a poker game, not having committed a single crime, but personal in nature. And then, of course, added to that, you have Wyatt Earp and the drama in Tombstone, right? And you have the story of Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War in New Mexico. And in both cases, right, is you had economic factors that were involved, where there was competition for contracts, especially with Billy the Kid, with cattle contracts with the local armed forces to sell their cattle to and make a lot of money from. And you had bribery and nepotism or favoritism, and sheriffs that began, throwing their weight around as a sheriff to bring about economically beneficial results for themselves. And then they would resort to violence against their opponents, their enemies. And so the lines between, law and order, good and bad, sometimes in the Western towns became blurred. And so with Billy the Kid, he received a lot of national empathy against his local sheriff and Mr. Murphy for being guilty, his opponents being guilty of murder and nepotism and graft. Graft is using inside information you have as a politician to make money in a given situation. And so you do have evidence of such phenomenon occurring in these Western towns. And this all, to my humble estimation, lends towards Turner's thesis of the West being wild, but you still having certain opportunities. And the main opportunity that I've mentioned so far is entrepreneurial through business. If you could find a good or service that you could provide to the miners, to the cowboys, you could make a lot of money, and quite a few people did. And then in addition to that, of course, you have let's see here, and also in the mining towns, you could make money off of extraction of the minerals. So you see here in the 1860s in Virginia City, 135 million, right, worth of mineral wealth was extracted. And you had Bonanza Kings who were moderately, poor prior to this, rise from rags to riches, right? A Horatio Algier story. John Mackay, James Fair, James Flood, William O'Brien. So it could and did happen at times. You see the Comstock lode of Nevada, 300 million, Montana yielded 20 million, and so forth, okay? And so if you got there early enough and laid a claim, the opportunities did exist to extract mineral wealth, all right? And let's see here. And we already talked about this. That's Wyatt Earp there. The bottom right is Billy the Kid. And at the top, you see, I want to say that's Buffalo Bill. That's covered. I can't tell from the hairline. But then that is John Wesley Hardin in the top middle. And he killed a handful of lawmen before he was shot in the back of the head in a bar room by a lawman. And so, that Western genre of movies and books, you have the stuff, the historical primary sources to fill that narrative up to some extent. But also, I'm not sure if I have it. I think I have it on a future slide, but just in case, I'm going to cover it now. But also by way of being a cowboy, I want to mention that as well. Okay, is at any given time, although I think it's soon here. Pardon here. Yeah, right here. Okay, 10 million cattle came from Texas alone, wild cattle to be claimed by anyone. Okay, Rutherford B. Hayes and other presidents kind of declared like a go for all to grab cattle, wild cattle in the West. And you see there 50,000 cowboys came down and grabbed them. And so you have the Goodnight Loving Trail, the Sedalia Trail, the Chisholm Trail, and anywhere, like I said, from 300 to 1,000-mile trails to the nearest train depots. And of course, the trek was difficult. You look at Clifford Westermeyer as an historian, or Candy Moulton, and other old school kind of Court Turner-like historians of the West. And they depict all the hardships that the cowboys went through, but they romanticize it and saying how tough it was, but they made it through it. And those who made it through it made fortunes in doing this. And notice here, a steer or a head of cattle could be either free or up to $10 in Texas. And that same steer could be sold for $75 in Eastern markets or in the slaughterhouse known as Chicago. And so that's pretty good profit margin. So let's see here. And then also, but the problem is with the cowboys, right, is the railroads eventually went all the way down deep into Texas and into the areas where the wild cattle existed. And so then there was no longer need for the long drive. And eventually all of them were claimed, right? And they came from Spanish stock, going back to 1540 with Coronado coming in and leaving thousands of head of cattle and horses to roam freely. And they obviously naturally progressed in numbers from generation to generation. They multiplied. So at any rate, yes, you have the cowboy phenomenon, but it came to an end when people were able to purchase and claim most of the Western land and fence it off with barbed wire, and railroads came and reached the far West, and there was no longer need for the drive. And so then cowboys became workers on the ranches and the farms, particularly the ranches, obviously. And they were paid as ranch hands, and they were not paid very handsomely. So their heyday kind of came and went pretty quickly, from about 1867 to the early 1880s. Just over a decade was arguably the heyday of the cowboy. But then also you have land, all right? The Homestead Act of 1862. This, in my estimation, supports Turner's thesis as well, is the government offered tracts of 160 acres of free land. You were supposed to pay a nominal fee of $10, but you could avoid that, says historian Paul Johnson. And you were to stay on it and cultivate it, and it was yours. And you were to declare loyalty to the Union, because this was amidst the Civil War, fighting the Confederacy of the South. And so at any rate, you see here, 400,000 families received homestead plots, right? And you see here, eventually from the 1860s to 1900, 300,000 Danish immigrants alone received or acquired a homestead on the plains. And so again, I would argue that this supports Turner's thesis, that there were opportunities. So we've mentioned entrepreneurial, we mentioned by way of mineral wealth, and now we're mentioning land, access to free or cheap land. And in addition to the Homestead Act, you also have squatters' rights, okay? And that goes back predominantly to Jackson's era, whereby if land is uncultivated and it's not being occupied or worked, you come in, you trespass, you begin living on it, you improve or cultivate it, and then you go to a local judge and claim that it's not being used, and that by virtue of your occupancy, but more importantly, your cultivation of the land, your quote improvement of the land, that you should have entitlement to that swath of land. And then it happened organically as we follow English common law from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So in some cases you had first rights to purchase it, but in other cases you were given the land outright for free. for having, quote, improved it. So you have squatters' rights as well as an opportunity to achieve the American dream in the West. And again, just another slide, another couple slides on immigrants. This one pertains to the Germans. And so we're going to get more into this when we do the Gilded Age, part 2, when we deal with immigration. But notice towns like St. Louis, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, right? Omaha, Nebraska, they took off by virtue of infrastructure development like railroads and commerce or trade, particularly Cincinnati and Chicago became known as the slaughterhouses, Cincinnati for pork and Chicago for beef at this time. And so people developed a bourgeoisie, the people of the city, literally, a middle class of merchants who traded, entrepreneurs with their businesses, creditors who lent money, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And the Germans in particular did economically well for themselves. All right. And I'll leave it at that if you don't mind, because this is a really long PowerPoint. I have 31 slides, not to scare you. And the same thing here, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Croatians came in and did well for themselves, moved into Minnesota in large numbers, even Texas and California, Wisconsin, et cetera. All right, let's see here. We already did this one with the cattle industry. Now, however, those who go against Turner's thesis, right, who want to revise or change it. So now we're getting into revisionist history. And so you have, for one, those who disagree theoretically with Frederick Jackson Turner and his thesis on the West, and saying that they don't believe that a frontier automatically creates an egalitarian society, that a frontier, undeveloped, quote, uncivilized ecosystem is going to automatically put everybody on equal footing. And they look at places like Argentina and Brazil and say, we don't see that happening there, right? So some have a problem with his theoretical foundation of his thesis. And then others contend that the West was not truly as dangerous as it might have been portrayed. Karl Metz is a big historian in that regard. And so, yeah, you have Karl Metz and others make the point that statistically, according to the primary sources, the murder rate and the number of gunfights, et cetera, were not any higher in the Western cattle towns and mining towns than they were in New York City. Okay. And then also what we're going to focus mainly upon now is the number 3 is critics contend that equality of opportunity was certainly not absolute, maybe relative. Maybe there were relative compared to the East Coast, more opportunities in the West, but they sure as heck don't think it goes so far as to say that equality of opportunity absolutely existed in the West. So let's look into that, if you will. But before we do, are there any questions? Any questions so far? Could I get a thumbs up from anybody? You guys doing okay? You're there, you can hear me fine? Thank you, Jason. All right, so good, good, good. All right, so again, always feel free to unmute yourself, okay, if you have any questions or comments to add. Let's see here. So for one, right, is Marxist history. And Marxist history, remember, contends that, for one, that whoever that life is about power, history is about power, and whoever controls the means of production and allocation of resources runs the show and determines the direction in which history turns. And they also contend that, in particular, capitalist economies are inherently parasitical. For one party to gain something, another party has to lose, right? And so in this case, they look at those who had political capital, those who had political connections, right? And contend that the West was unfairly theirs. So what better example of that, I thought, in doing Marxist history than the railroads. The railroads received just a ridiculous amount of subsidies or economic help from the federal government. Bear with me just a moment here. I am reading from Howard Zinn's A People's History, which is unapologetically a Marxist history book. All right. And it says here on page 254, the first transcontinental railroad was built with blood, sweat, politics, and thievery out of the meeting of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads. The Central Pacific, which began in California, right, with the big four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and of course, I'm forgetting the fourth one at the moment. The Central Pacific started on the West Coast going east. It spent $200,000 in Washington on bribes to get 9 million acres of free land and $24 million in bonds, and paid $79 million, an overpayment of $36 million to a construction company which was really its own. Okay, the construction was done by 3,000 Irish and 10,000 Chinese over a period. The source I've read said actually 14,000 Chinese. Over a period of 4 years, working for $1 or $2 a day. The Union Pacific started in Nebraska going westwardly. It had been given 12 million acres of free land and $27 million in government bonds. It created the Credit Mobilier Company and gave them $94 million for construction when the actual cost was only $44 million. Shares were sold cheaply to congressmen to prevent investigation. It was known as the Credit Mobilier scandal. So at any rate, right, the railroads, they would receive so much land on either side of their tracks per mile that they laid. And they would get the minimum amount if it were declared by the surveyors as flat land, more than that if it was laden with hills. And then the most in acreage granted to them if it was declared mountainous, and they had to like blast holes and tunnels through the mountains, like the Sierra Nevada and the Rockies. So at any rate, what they would do sometimes is they would bribe and cheat the land surveying process, and they would declare an area mountainous that was as flat as a table. And the Central Pacific, for instance, declared the beginning of the Sierra Nevada going eastwardly from Sacramento through Roseville, going on into the Sierra Nevada. They were able to declare the Sierra Nevada mountain range beginning 15 to 20 miles before it actually began. So for those 15 to 20 miles, they were given the maximum amount of land as if it were mountainous when it was not. And this happened quite often. And their own construction companies, right? They would pay themselves to construct the railroad, and they were subsidized. They were given bonds where people would buy bond certificates from the government and be promised that money back plus interest. So the public money helped with the railroads. And why would you say, right? Is the Republican parties were following what Alexander Hamilton had claimed, is that what's good for the railroads is good for the United States, that the country itself, by way of trade and transportation, will benefit from it. And also that that railroad building entails on its own in a private economy too much deferred gratification, too much work, too much overhead or money spent before you get a penny of income coming in. And so therefore they need help. They need the government to help, not only help them do it, but help them decide upon such a costly venture for the good of the whole country, supposedly. So that's how they would get these subsidies and this help from the federal government. And when they came in, right, the government was good to keep a lot of the public domain that was becoming surveyed to be auctioned off at $1.25 an acre. The railroads pumped up their free land that they were given on each side of the tracks up to over $5 an acre right off the bat. So they took advantage for sure and tried to maximize their profits. Also, if they were coming in to a certain area and the people in that area had already claimed that land as squatters, right? And in one case at Muscle Slough, the showdown at Muscle Slough in Southern California, you had a group of farmers who had been granted that land by squatters' rights by way of a judge in his decision. So they had the paperwork to claim that land, right? Well, that land happened to be within the swath of the Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad. So when the Santa Fe Railroad came into town and its tracks were coming right into their territory, the railroad, of course, said, you must leave. This land has been allotted to us. And they said, of course, no. They refused because they had a local judge grant that land to them. Well, they said, well, our jurisdiction over it trumps yours because our jurisdiction comes from the federal government, Congress. And so they ordered a marshal and deputy there at Muscle Slough to make the inhabitants evacuate. They refused and shot and killed the deputy. And so then the railroad flexed its muscles back in Congress and got a regiment of the army to come in and forcefully kick them off their land, and so that the railroad could come through. So to me, that's evidence of revisionist history, of Marxist history in particular, that those with more money, those with more capital prevailed in the West. So the heck with the idea of equality of opportunity truly existing in the West. All right. Are there any questions so far? All right. Then also they use dummy names. The railroads did and the corporations, so that people would not realize that the corporation was buying up most of the land. There were lots of ways in which they could use their political leverage and their money to their own advantage. Another way was getting rebates from the railroads. Rockefeller would become famous for this with his oil, is whereby they would say, okay, quid pro quo, right? You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. What if I promise you so many tons of this given commodity on your railroad, and you could charge me by the pound? So I'll bring you in a lot of money, right, through economies of scale. What will you do for me so that I don't go to another railroad? And they would say, well, we'll give you a 40% rebate on the price per pound. And of course, they would not do that for smaller farmers and other smaller retailers. And so the railroads played favorites, and they played favorites with the wealthy. So that happened. Then also the mechanization of mining, the mechanization of agriculture really helped, arguably, the wealthy more than it did the poor. Because for a very simple reason is the machines that you see here were expensive. So the mechanical reaper, the harvester combine, the threshers, those required a lot of capital, a lot of money to begin with. And corporations, right, they sell shares on the public stock exchange. And so they have, thousands, if not more, people throughout the world who are buying stock and investing in their company, and they're able to play with that money. And so if you're a small mom and pop shop or small mom and pop farm, good luck in contending with that, right? They could just pull a Walmart on you and by economies of scale, put their price at a lower, cheaper rate and undersell you in mass quantities. So at any rate, you have that. Notice here, right? Harvesting an acre of wheat entailed 61 hours of labor before the Civil War. It entailed only 3 hours and 19 minutes after the Civil War. So equipment, the mechanization of farming and mining, they were game changers, arguably. All right. And so then you have the development of the grangers or the populists, and they were angry. These are small scale cash crop farmers. Okay. So these are people who they're not content with subsisting, becoming subsistence farmers of just growing their own food and eating off their own land. They wanted to achieve the American dream. They wanted to focus on one crop or two and sell it for profit, right? But they could not hang with the big guys. And the railroads and the storage facilities were sticking it to them for the grain silos and the transporting of their finished wheat, etc. And so they wanted a bigger government. They wanted government to come in and regulate these quote middlemen and put price ceilings on how much they could charge the farmers per pound for storage and for transportation. And they also congregated together. And in some cases, they shared machinery. They bought it in common because they couldn't afford it on their own. They shared capital to some extent. They shared information and tips on farming with one another. And they wanted a sense of camaraderie, etc. So even like county fairs come from this. But they eventually formed a national third party known as the Populist Party. And on the one hand, populism has a positive connotation. It's saying, hey, we are the common folk. We are Thomas Jefferson's salt of the earth, right? We weren't born with a silver spoon in our mouths. We're just trying to achieve the American dream against the big hated corporations and railroads. And to the negative connotation is the populists were rather intolerant and bigoted. They were anti-immigration. They were anti-African American. They were anti-city and intellectual. And so, you have that component to the populists and to the local Granger units as well. All right. But notice one thing that they flirted with gas and water socialism is they wanted the national ownership of all the railroads. They wanted the federal government to take over the railroads. All right, let's see here. And then also the same thing happened with mechanization in mining. They were known as the air-powered and water-powered drills, the pneumatic and hydraulic drills, also quartz mining, very expensive, methodical process that required a lot of money or capital to engage in. So the average person who came into the Comstock lode, who came into Montana and Idaho and South Dakota and North Dakota for mining, oftentimes if he or she did not get there soon enough, quickly enough, most of the wealth was too deeply embedded within the mountainsides and in the caves for their mere pickaxe to extract. And so therefore the corporations came in and they extracted, according to our textbook, the majority of the mineral wealth in the West through big machines. All right. So then the average person had to just get paid an hourly low wage working for these mining corporations. Let's see here. Then Chinese. The Chinese coming in, right? The immigration. In 1847, they had like fewer than a dozen registered at the California census of African Americans and of Asians. And by 1852, they had over 40,000 Asians registered. So tens of thousands of Chinese immigrants came during the gold rush from 48 to about 52, 53. And coming in, right? Remember, we're talking about Turner's thesis, equality of opportunity. What about the Asians? Did they really enjoy equality of opportunity? And it's pretty much a rhetorical question. The answer to it is obvious. No, they did not. So Charles Crocker, he saw the coolie system that was going on, COOLIE. And with the coolie system, they were exploiting in Polynesian islands, Asian labor in the sugar fields in particular. And so that extended itself into California. And so with these contract kind of modern day indentured servants who would have to work off an indebted contract for an extended period of time and do very arduous labor. So with the Chinese, they had push factors. They had the Taiping Rebellion, right, which was a devastating civil war. The Guangdong Peninsula was in particular very hardly hit by this civil war. And then you also had the factors, these middlemen, these brokers who came into the Guangdong province of China, knew the language and the people, and enlisted their supposedly voluntary decisions to work under contract in the States. And so Crocker heard about this. He was familiar with it, and he experimented when he was short on labor with the Central Pacific. And he made a bet as to how much in track they could lay in a day, and they did so. They were up to standard and beyond, and so he hired anywhere from 10 to 14,000 Chinese immigrant laborers to build the Central Pacific. They were known. They developed a reputation in the press amongst the employers as being diligent, so very hardworking, efficient, being very quick, and getting a lot done in a certain amount of time, and also being docile and hence humble, meek, do as they're told, not defiant at all, not filled with expectations or entitlement. And so hence, sadly, they were the very ideal exploitable laborers. And so you find that to be very sadly ironic in the case with the Chinese. And by the way, 1,200 of them are going to die building the Central Pacific Railroad, 1,200. So at any rate, they're going to be sent to do the work with the nitroglycerin, the explosives, to build tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, to work through the snow and the elements, etc. And they were treated awfully. Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki. I would highly recommend that book. A very, very informative, interesting book on Asian American history. So at any rate, you see a foreign miners tax and licensing tax law in 1850 and 1852. You see in 55, tax passengers ineligible for citizenship, so mainly Chinese, were to pay the person bringing them was to pay a $50 tax. And that was back then. That's a lot of money. Look at this, 1858, California passed an act to prevent the further immigration of Chinese or Mongolians. They were called Mongolians because there was a Mongolian dynasty at that time, and the Mongolian queue that they would wear their hair in. And they also called their own kingdom Zhongguo, or the Celestial Kingdom. And so they were called Celestials and Mongols as well as Chinese. So let's see here. And look at here, in 1870, Congress declared Asians unfit to be naturalized as citizens. Yikes, right? And then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act forbade the further immigration of Chinese laborers. And they tried to enforce that on Angel Island outside San Francisco. Then Hispanics or Latinos, ever since the Mexican-American War, they were promised in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to have the rights of citizenship, including the rights to retain their property. However, they had to prove it in a court of law, and it was the standards were very, very strict as far as proof with latitude and longitude lines, the proper authority signatures and dates. And a lot of the Hispanic landowners didn't have that on their persons. And so it became a difficult fight in the courts to hold on to their land. A lot of them also received large land contracts in the Spanish and the Mexican periods of controlling Texas and California. and in particular. And so with the land grants, some of them being large, they also, many of them were pastoral with sheep and cattle. And so they didn't cultivate the land, a lot of the acreage. And so it looked to, the stranger's eye as if no one were inhabiting certain segments of their properties. And so squatters came and tried to take chunks from their land, from their property, and fought them in the courts for it. And in some cases, they won, the squatters, that is. And so Hispanics began losing their land. And before you know it, especially with the, again, with the mechanization of mining and the mechanization of agriculture, the Hispanic population, especially when it was, when it coexisted with Mexican immigration from the northern Mexican states. So Durango, Chihuahua, Coahuila, Sinaloa, Sonora, they came into California, into Texas in large numbers. And so they became a readily available labor pool. And then also you had stigmas upon Mexican Americans as being very debased, very low morally, untrustworthy, violent, etc. So the idea is what better group to do the grunt work than Latinos. And so they were kind of pigeonholed. They were stigmatized and pigeonholed, kind of stuck into what they would call the proletariat, the manual labor workers in an industrial economy. And so, so menial jobs, the service sectors, cooks and cleaners, dishwashers, criadas, right, like who clean rooms. They worked in the obrajes, the factories. They, of course, did field work, especially in southern Texas, working with a myriad of fruits and vegetable cultivation. And then also, it didn't take long in the mid to late 1800s for states like Texas and New Mexico and California to formally segregate Mexican Americans. And they literally had, like with education, I kid you not, in Texas, they had brown schools, as well as in New Mexico, for Mexican American kids. They segregated them. And it happened de facto, not even just by law. People would refuse to sell their property to Mexican American families, etc. And so segregation with habitation, with living, happened for sure. And so at any rate, how did the Mexican Americans respond to this? Well, for one, they fought within the system. Two, they fought beyond the system. And thirdly, they maintained their culture very well, very successfully. So let's see here. So some came and worked, and they accepted their plight in the proletariat. And so vaqueros, or ranch hands, or cowboys that worked just for menial wages on ranches in Texas and in Colorado, and of course in California, Mexican immigrants as well as Mexican Americans. They helped build infrastructure, the Kansas and Topeka Railroad, the Santa Fe, in mining, especially the Anaconda copper mines in Arizona. Predominantly hired Hispanic laborers and didn't pay them very well and exploited them. And then I already mentioned southern Texas, out in the fields. In California, however, they did not constitute the majority of migrant workers until arguably perhaps the second decade of the 1900s. Before that, it remained Asians. Chinese, Japanese, and predominantly Filipino laborers. So at any rate, but you did have exceptions. You had a Mexican bourgeoisie that existed in Los Angeles and San Antonio, Texas, and in Tucson, Arizona, as well as Santa Fe, New Mexico, of intellectuals who were college educated as writers and journalists and attorneys, etc. they're even going to, well, we're going to get to that later. They're going to begin to politically organize, but not yet really in the late 1800s. Um, so yeah, so some are going to try to accommodate with the white man. This quote here says basically they're developed, and I should have this already on Canvas for you to look at in more detail. But they're developed kind of a hierarchy amongst the Hispanic population of those who are well-to-do. They oftentimes worked as the middlemen or the brokers between the Anglo establishments and corporate farms and mining corporations and the common Mexican American and Mexican immigrant people, and getting them jobs. But oftentimes those jobs entailed a lot of hard work and did not pay very well and did not offer much of a chance of ascendance, of moving up the socioeconomic ladder. Then Richard King and other big barons of Texas, etc., they would hire Mexican middlemen overseers over their cash crops. But again, those tended to have been the exception rather than the rule. So some fought within the system to try to do well for themselves. They rose up and they formed a people of the city, a bourgeois, economic faction, if you will, in some cities. Some of them collaborated with the Anglos, like the famous Santa Fe Ring in New Mexico. But also you had downright violence that was suffered. So you notice here, right, in 1855 in the Nueces River region, between the Nueces and the Rio Bravo del Norte, or the Rio Grande, 11 Mexican merchants were murdered. And a lot of it, like with the Asians, it went back to, ironically, a developing reputation amongst Latinos for being the ideal laborers, for working diligently and efficiently and doing as they're told. And that ironically is going to elicit from poor white working class Americans jealousy, fear of losing their place to them. And so economic jealousy definitely plays a part in some of this. All right. So let's see here. Yeah, I could be here all day if I went under each of these and explained each incident. Look at this one, De Leon versus Jane Desart, Anglo men and Mexican-American women, and Aureliano Castellon and Emma Stanfield. You have a double standard where there was a lot of racism against white women marrying Mexican-American men, but it was okay for white men to marry Mexican-American women. And so the Mexican Americans, they created mutual aid societies to help one another. They're going to form their own fraternal societies and church organizations, compadrazgo, right? Godparents, and the system of a kind of a tent support really helped out a lot of Mexican Americans as well, and continued throughout this time period. The populists would not allow Mexican Americans into their ranks, sadly. And so you have to worry about that as well. So, access to the American dream for Mexican Americans was limited. And how did they respond? Some of them just acquiesced to their plight, just gave in and worked their manual labor jobs and lived their own private lives. Some tried to rise within the system, as I mentioned, by way of becoming entrepreneurs themselves, joining a Mexican intelligentsia, a Mexican-American intelligentsia. Others tried to fight back in becoming politicians. Esteban Ochoa, the Navarro family of New Mexico. Esteban Ochoa was the mayor of Tucson. You have your exceptions. You had your gorras blancas, your white hats, and they formed a political organization and a political party and ran people for office and tried to help out the Mexican-American community. And they fought with big white corporate ranchers. All right. And then some fought outside the system, right? So Gregorio Cortez, Cheno Cortina, Joaquin Murrieta, that they named Zorro after, right? So some became social bandits and fought against the system by way of banditry, of largely theft. All right. Let's see here. And they developed kind of a, like the Legend of Zorro, somewhat of a Robin Hood reputation amongst the Hispanic population. And I already mentioned the Santa Fe ring of Hispanic and Anglo well-to-do businessmen, lawyers, bankers, etc. And then if the American dream was thwarted, if there were unique obstacles placed before Asian Americans and placed before Hispanic Americans, you could definitely say the same for Native Americans. All right. So these treaties, right? They applied the Fifth Amendment, and what they were oftentimes doing is it was factional, good old factional politics, is both parties were trying to win votes, and people wanted land. They wanted westward land. So they wanted to give first access to crossing the country to their voters. And then as more and more mineral bonanzas opened up, right, to find silver and gold, etc., and more railroad depots and towns off the railroads were established, they began going further and further back on their word and giving that land in the West to the tribes. And they began making them come back to the diplomatic table and revise the conditions of their things. And it's almost a joke because you see in some of the treaties, they use the term in perpetuity, forever. The land was supposed to be given to Native Americans. And in some cases, in perpetuity lasted fewer than 7 years, like with the Transcontinental Railroad coming through in Kansas. Their in perpetuity lasted fewer than 7 years. So at any rate, that's going to happen, trying to win votes, claiming the Fifth Amendment, that people's lives, liberty, and property are to be protected by the federal government. So the federal government would insist upon putting strings of forts and railroads and blazed roads through the Native American territories. And with those roads, the famous one I think of is the Bozeman Trail, Bozeman. And the Bozeman Trail went up through the upper high plains, and the Native Americans were infuriated by this and threatened by it, because it killed off their game. It encouraged people to stay rather than simply travel through their territory. And violence would ensue as well. So at any rate, you also have isolated incidents. You have, because the Bureau of Indian Affairs was under the Secretary of the Interior, and who in turn was under the president. And the president's bureaucracy with this bureau developed a bad reputation. And so did the Department of the Trans-Missouri Theater, those west of the Missouri River, with the armed forces in charge of Native American affairs. And most infamously, you had Philip Sheridan, who supposedly stated, "The only good Indian I ever knew was a dead one." And so, you have individuals, you have isolated incidents. The government tried to get the Native Americans to become dependent upon the federal government through these treaties and through annuities, these annual payments that they were given with food and coffee and basic needed supplies. They now become dependent upon the federal government. And they already laid the legal foundation for that with the McIntosh case decades prior to this, where they stated that the Native Americans are the ward of the state, WARD. And a ward of the state is like an orphan child or someone in a penitentiary, someone in a uniquely dependent status underneath the federal government. And so in Minnesota, the annuity stopped coming, and the people were literally starving. So the warriors went off and left the reservation and hunted and got in an altercation with some private citizens, Anglo citizens, and killed them, and that started a war. Then when that war broke out in Minnesota, back in Denver, Colorado, Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington decided to attack the Cheyenne allies to the Sioux at Sand Creek, and it became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. You had a Brule Sioux chief who fought with General Grattan over a darn stray cow. I kid you not. And Grattan killed the Brule Sioux chief, and the warriors in turn attacked Grattan and killed Grattan and his men. You had violence on the Bozeman Trail, where Red Cloud and Crazy Horse of the Sioux tribes fought against the establishment of this military road, and they ended up killing Fetterman and his 100 men, and drama ensued from that as well. And then, of course, Sheridan declared that if you did not adhere in the Upper Plains to the Fort Laramie Treaty that dictated that at a certain time of the year, you're on your reservation and you do not attack Anglos coming through. But if you're not on your reservation, you're to be declared a hostile and you could be shot on sight or forcefully brought back to the reservation. And so the Native Americans who never had signed the white man's, had never touched the white man's pen and signed these treaties to begin with, they began meeting in the Powder River Valley of Montana, awaiting, knowing that the army was going to come for them. And General Custer and his men came in, and he arrogantly split his men into 3 groups and tried to attack Little Bighorn village from the south. And it did not end well. He and his men were killed. And however much he was guilty of hubris, of arrogance, he was looked upon in the press as a martyr to the general American public. And so there was a large following for revenge and justice upon the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho who had killed George Custer and his 7th Cavalry men. So at any rate, yeah, the story goes on and on. You had your own wars with the Apache down in the South that lasted a little bit longer than the 1870s. So you see here, Red Cloud was against the Bozeman Trail. So was Crazy Horse. They met in the Powder River Valley. Little Bighorn happened in late June of 1876. That's a picture of Philip Sheridan, who declared them hostiles. And you'll see this in the handout if you haven't read it yet. Look at this, John Pope to the Minnesota massacres. It is my purpose to utterly exterminate the Sioux. They literally use that term, extermination. And remember, you annihilate or you murder a human being, you exterminate a pest like a cockroach. So dehumanization, and it may not be too far to say, limitedly at least, attempted genocide of Native Americans in the far West. All right, so are there any questions? Any questions at all? I think we have a few more followers. Let me make sure I have everyone's name. Great, I have all 8 of your names. All right, so can I get a, if it's not too much to ask, could I get a thumbs up again? Are you guys good? You feel relatively prepared to do this Thank you. Thank you, all of you. I appreciate that. All right. Great, great, great. All right. So if you have any questions, just contact me. I have a couple cell phone numbers available on the syllabus and online. And I have, of course, Canvas Message is my main go-to that I prefer. All right. So you guys have a great week. You have until Sunday night to do this. Be sure to take a look at the test questions that pertain to this subject as you prepare yourself for that after we cover the first 3 or 4 assignments. And you guys have a great week, okay? I appreciate you coming here. All right, thank you.